I walked into the boardroom looking like a delivery driver who had lost her way, but I was the only person in the room who knew exactly how to burn their empire to the ground. Within 60 seconds, I went from a target of their mockery to the architect of their total destruction. I walked into the boardroom of Sterling Global Holdings wearing a thrifted blazer that had cost me $12, holding a portfolio that held the future of 3 different shipping logistics firms. I didn't look like I belonged in the top floor of a glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of the financial district. I looked like a delivery driver who had taken a wrong turn at the lobby elevator. That was the point. Elias Sterling, the CEO, didn't believe in checking credentials if the person standing in front of him didn't fit the correct aesthetic. He preferred to judge, dissect, and discard. As I approached the mahogany doors, his assistant, a young man who looked like he'd been groomed to worship the ground Elias walked on, sneered at me. "Deliveries are in the basement, miss. The freight elevator is around the corner. We don't accept packages on the executive floor." I didn't blink. I adjusted my glasses and kept walking. "I'm not a courier, Tyler. I'm here for the 10 o'clock. Tell Mr. Sterling that my advance is here to finalize the acquisition." Tyler's face twisted into something resembling pity. "Mr. Sterling doesn't have time for pranks. He's currently in a meeting with the board regarding the regional logistics merger. Unless you're the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, you're in the wrong place. And last time I checked, they weren't hiring people who look like, well, you." I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest, the cold, sharp focus that had helped me build my wealth from nothing. I didn't raise my voice. I simply leaned against his pristine glass desk and pulled out my phone. I'll give him 60 seconds to decide if he wants to keep his company or watch it be dismantled by the end of the business day. You choose whether you want to be the one who tells him he missed the opportunity of a lifetime, or if you'd rather keep your job. Tyler hesitated, his smug composure wavering for the briefest of seconds before he scoffed and pressed the intercom button. "Sir, there's a woman here. She says she's here about the acquisition. She's persistent." A burst of laughter echoed through the speaker. It was a deep, arrogant sound, the sound of a man who had never been told no in his life. "Send her in, Tyler. I need a laugh before we gut the competition. Let's see what kind of joke the universe has sent me today." I pushed open the doors to the boardroom. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the palpable disdain of 12 men in tailored suits. At the head of the table sat Elias Sterling. He looked up, his eyes sweeping over me with the same cold indifference one might use to inspect a stain on a rug. He didn't even bother to stand. "You're late," he said, gesturing to a plastic folding chair in the corner that had clearly been dragged in from a break room. "Sit down. Try not to get any dust on the carpet. So tell me, what makes a woman who looks like she's lost her way to the local job center think she has any business sitting at a table where we're discussing 9-figure contracts?" The other men chuckled. One of them, a man with graying temples, leaned back and smirked. "Maybe she's here to clean the windows, Elias. They do look a bit smudged." I stood in the center of the room, feeling the weight of the digital assets in my pocket. I looked at Elias, noticing the way he played with his gold watch, the way his eyes danced with the thrill of bullying someone he deemed inferior. He thought I was a target. He thought I was a nobody who would shrink under the weight of his mockery. "I'm not here to clean anything, Elias," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the room like a blade. "I'm here because your firm is bleeding. You've got a massive gap in your supply chain that you've been trying to patch with a shaky, organized scheme involving third-party shipping vendors. You think you're smart, moving those crates through the northern ports? But you've been sloppy. You're under a lot of pressure because the Service of Internal Security has been poking around your warehouses lately. You're desperate for this merger because if it doesn't go through, the bank is going to notice that the money you've been moving doesn't actually exist." The laughter in the room died instantly. Elias's face turned from mocking to a mask of stone. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to? You're throwing around dangerous allegations. If I wanted to, I could have you dragged out of here for harassment. I could have you facing a heavy investigation by morning." I didn't flinch. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single, thin tablet. I tossed it onto the table. It slid across the polished wood, coming to rest right in front of him. I don't care about your threats, Elias. I'm not just a woman in a cheap blazer. I'm the majority shareholder of the very logistics network you've been trying to infiltrate for the last 6 months. And I just bought the company that holds your debt. Elias stared at the tablet, his hand hovering over it as if it were a bomb. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden dawning realization. Then, he slowly tapped the screen. As the confidential data popped up, the real numbers, the real owners, and the real extent of my control, the color drained from his face until he looked like a ghost. He wasn't laughing anymore. He was staring at the screen, and for the first time, his hands started to tremble. He looked up at me, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked terror. "How?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Who are you, really?" I leaned in closer, dropping my voice to a whisper that only he could hear. "I am the person who's going to make sure you never walk out of this building as a free man." The room went so quiet that the hum of the ventilation system sounded like a jet engine. Elias's knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his eyes glued to the tablet display. It wasn't just a list of assets. It was a digital map of his entire professional life, laid bare with surgical precision. I had spent 2 years tracking his every move, every illicit transaction, and every shell company he used to hide the fact that his empire was nothing but a house of cards. "You're mistaken," Elias finally managed, though his voice lacked any conviction. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a strangled wheeze. "This is a forgery, a sophisticated bit of hacking. You've intercepted a private database and fabricated the links. My legal team will bury you under an avalanche of litigation before lunch." He looked around the table at his board members, desperate for them to back him up. But they were frozen. They weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at the tablet. They were smart men who loved money more than they loved loyalty. When they saw the sheer volume of my portfolio, when they realized that I was the phantom buyer who had been quietly acquiring their own personal stakes in the firm, the room shifted. Their allegiance dissolved in seconds, replaced by the instinct for self-preservation. "Elias," the gray-haired man said quietly, not looking up from the screen. "The metadata on these transfers, they're time-stamped, and the signatures are verified. This isn't a hack. It's an audit." I stepped forward, pulling a thin folder from my bag and placing it gently on top of his phone. "An audit is exactly right, but it's not for the tax authorities. It's for the Service of Internal Security. You see, Elias, you made a grave mistake when you tried to cut corners with those shipping contracts. You thought that by funneling those suspicious packages through my lanes, I wouldn't notice. But I didn't just notice. I tracked them. I verified every single connection to your organized group. I have enough evidence here to warrant an immediate seizure of every asset in this building." Elias leaned back, his face a mottled shade of red. He was shaking, not with fear anymore, but with a blind, panicked rage. He started to reach for his desk drawer, his fingers twitching toward the handle, but I didn't break eye contact. "Don't," I warned, my voice cold and flat. "If you open that drawer, I've already alerted the authorities that you're armed and ready to initiate a confrontation. They're already in the lobby, Elias. They aren't here for a meeting. They're here to process an arrest." He stopped, his hand hovering over the drawer. He looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time. He stopped seeing the clothes and started seeing the predator in the room. He realized that the woman he had dismissed as a nuisance was actually the one holding the leash of his life. "You're doing this because of the logistics deal?" he hissed. "You're ruining a global entity over a shipping dispute?" "I'm doing this because you're a predator who thinks his wealth grants him immunity," I replied. "But money is just a tool, Elias, and you've run out of ways to use it." I turned to the board members. "The motion to remove Elias Sterling as CEO is on that screen. It requires a majority vote. If you sign it, you retain your positions, and we begin the process of untangling this mess. If you don't, you're all complicit in everything he's done. The files go to the Service of Internal Security regardless. The only choice you have left is whether you go down with him or survive the fallout." The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. One by one, the men around the table reached for their tablets. Elias watched in horror as his own hand-picked board members began signing their digital signatures, authorizing his removal. He looked like a man watching his own funeral. He slammed his fist onto the table, causing the crystal water glasses to jump. "You think this is over?" he snarled, his eyes darting to the door. "You think you can just walk in here, take my life's work, and walk out? You're going to find out exactly how much power I still have when I'm cornered." He pulled his phone out, his thumbs flying across the screen. I knew he was calling his security chief, the men he kept on retainer to handle his dirty business. I didn't stop him. I let him make the call. I let him believe he was still in control. "I've got the security team in the parking garage," Elias said, a sick, victorious grin spreading across his face as he put the phone down. "They'll be here in 30 seconds. They don't follow corporate rules. They follow my rules. You're not walking out of here, Maya. You're going to be a cautionary tale." I stood my ground, my heart hammering against my ribs, but my face remained an impassive mask. I looked at my watch. 30 seconds. I had planned for this, but the margin for error was razor thin. I heard the muffled sound of heavy boots echoing from the hallway, growing louder and more rhythmic by the second. "You should have checked who I bought, Elias," I said, as the boardroom doors burst open with a deafening crash, revealing 5 men in tactical gear with their weapons drawn. But they weren't looking at me. They were looking at Elias. "Drop the weapons, Sterling," the lead officer shouted, his voice echoing off the glass walls. Elias turned, his face turning ghostly white, as he realized the men entering the room weren't his private security. They were the federal agents he had been bribing for years. And they weren't there to protect him. They were there to fulfill the warrant I had spent all morning ensuring was signed. "What is this?" he shrieked, backing away. "I pay you! I pay all of you!" The lead agent walked up to the table, ignoring Elias, and stopped right in front of me. He pulled a thick, sealed envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table. "Ms. Vance, everything is in order. We have the proof of the organized scheme and the documentation for the illegal goods. He's all yours." I looked at Elias, who was now being pinned against the wall by 2 agents. He was staring at me with such pure, unadulterated hatred that I knew if he ever got out, I would be his first target. But as I opened the envelope to verify the contents, I realized the final piece of the puzzle, the one thing I hadn't accounted for, was staring back at me from the first page of the file. My breath hitched. The documents weren't just about Elias. My own name was at the top of the file, listed as the primary financier of the entire criminal network. I looked up at the agent, whose expression had suddenly turned cold and unfamiliar. "There's been a slight complication, Ms. Vance," the agent said, his voice dropping to a whisper as he clicked a pair of handcuffs onto my wrists. "It seems you've been doing business with more people than you thought. And we have a witness who says you were the one pulling the strings all along." The cold bite of the steel against my wrists was a sensation I had spent my entire life avoiding. The room, which only moments ago had been my theater of victory, transformed into a cage of betrayal. Elias Sterling, still pinned against the mahogany paneling by the agents, let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a manic joy. "Did you hear that?" Elias crowed, struggling against the grip of the officers. "She's the architect. She's the one who built the labyrinth. You think you've caught me, but you've just handed the keys to the kingdom to someone far more dangerous." I didn't panic. My mind raced, stripping away the layers of the situation.
I looked at the lead agent, a man I had been feeding information to for months. His face was a void. He wasn't acting under the orders I knew. He was acting under a mandate that had been scrubbed clean of my influence. Someone had deep-pocketed the Service of Internal Security, and they had done it fast. "I didn't authorize this," I said, my voice ice-cold. "I provided the evidence. I am the one who filed the report." The agent leaned in close, his face inches from mine.
You provided the evidence that allowed us to map the entire organized scheme, Ms. Vance, but you also provided the trail that leads back to your own private servers. It's remarkably clean. Too clean. It looks like you were trimming the fat, getting rid of a business partner who was becoming a liability. We aren't just here to take down Sterling, we're here to decapitate the entire network, and you're the head of the snake. He pulled a device from his belt and signaled the other agents. Bag the evidence, all of it, especially her private drive. My heart sank. My private drive didn't just contain evidence against Elias, it contained the encryption keys for my entire financial empire. If they took that, I wouldn't just be facing a heavy investigation, I would be completely liquidated. My assets would be frozen, my holdings seized, and my enemies would have a free pass to strip me of everything I'd spent a decade building. I looked at the board members, who were now scrambling to detach themselves from the conversation, their faces pale as they realized the danger of being in the room. They had signed the motion to remove Elias, but now they were trapped in a crime scene. "You're making a mistake," I said, looking directly at the camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. I knew the Service of Internal Security was recording everything. If you think Elias is the only one with influence in this building, you're wrong. I have lawyers currently filing an emergency injunction that will stop this seizure the moment it hits the federal docket. You're overreaching, and you're going to be held accountable. The agent smirked. Your lawyers are currently being detained for questioning regarding their involvement in this organized scheme. You're on your own, Maya. He hauled me toward the exit. As we passed Elias, he leaned toward me, his face twisted in a mocking sneer. You really thought you could play me? You're just a temporary occupant in a game you don't understand. By tomorrow, I'll be out on bail, and you'll be the one staring at the prospect of an enormous sentence. I look forward to watching your life crumble from the other side of the glass. We reached the elevator, and the doors slid open. Waiting inside wasn't a fellow officer, but a woman in a sharp gray suit, a woman I recognized instantly. It was Sarah Thorne, the lead counsel for the very firm I had just acquired. She held a briefcase tightly in her arms and looked at me with an expression that wasn't sympathy, but clinical detachment. Ms. Vance, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. It's time to discuss the transition of your assets. Since you're no longer in a position to manage your portfolio, the Board of Trustees has authorized an emergency liquidation. You're being divested of all interests, effective immediately. I felt the ground shift beneath me. The betrayal wasn't just coming from the authorities, it was internal. My own company, the one I had meticulously guarded, had been turned against me. I was being dismantled piece by piece. Who paid you, Sarah? I hissed, the cold air of the elevator hitting my skin. Sarah didn't answer. She simply looked at the agent and nodded. She's all yours. The board has no interest in her legal defense. As the elevator doors began to close, Sarah leaned forward and whispered something that made my blood run cold. You never should have challenged the people who taught you how to play the game, Maya. You were always just a placeholder. The elevator plunged downward, but my mind was stuck on the one piece of information she had just leaked. She hadn't said Elias paid them. She had mentioned the Board of Trustees. But I had bought the board. I owned their contracts. Then it hit me. I hadn't bought the board. I had been shown fake documents that made me believe I had. I had been played by an even larger, more dangerous shadow. The doors opened to the lobby, and I saw a crowd of reporters swarming the glass entrance, cameras flashing, waiting for the woman who was about to be branded a criminal mastermind. I looked up, and through the glass doors, I saw the one person I never expected to see again. A man who had died in a private plane crash 5 years ago. He was standing on the sidewalk, watching the chaos with a calm, predatory smile, holding a folder that had the same crest as the one I had just been handed. He wasn't just watching. He was waiting. He was the one who had set me up. My pulse spiked as I realized the true scope of the trap. He started to walk toward the entrance, his eyes locking onto mine through the thick glass. I realized then that my life wasn't over. It was being stolen. And as the agents tightened their grip on my arms, I saw him mouth 3 words that sent me into a blind panic. "Welcome back, Maya." The lobby was a cacophony of camera shutters and aggressive shouting, a blur of flashbulbs that burned my retinas. The man standing on the other side of the glass, the man who was supposed to be 6 feet under, didn't move. He stood perfectly still, a ghost in a bespoke charcoal suit, watching the agents drag me toward the waiting transport. His name, Julian Vane, was the one that had been scrubbed from every database in the country, the man whose demise had allowed me to rise in the vacuum he left behind. If he was here, it meant everything I had built, every deal, every acquisition, every secret I'd unearthed, wasn't just a discovery. It was a carefully curated path laid out for me by the very man I had been trying to dismantle. "Move it!" the lead agent barked, shoving me forward. My heels skidded on the polished marble of the lobby floor. I caught a glimpse of my own reflection in the glass revolving doors, disheveled, desperate, and completely exposed. As we pushed through the crowd, I saw Julian signal to a woman standing near the security desk. She wasn't one of the federal agents. She was my personal head of security, the woman who had been my shadow for 3 years, the one person I trusted with my life. She handed a small, encrypted drive to the lead agent, her expression blank, devoid of any recognition. My stomach dropped. She hadn't just been my head of security. She had been my jailer, recording every move, feeding every private conversation back to Vane. "He's waiting for you, Maya," she whispered as they dragged me past her, her voice no louder than a rustle of silk. "He wants to see if you've learned anything at all." I was shoved into the back of a black SUV. The door slammed shut with a finality that made my ears ring. The interior smelled of leather and ozone. The lead agent hopped into the driver's seat, and the SUV pulled away from the curb, leaving the chaos of the news crews and the screaming reporters behind. Julian Vane didn't follow in a car. He simply melted back into the shadows of the building's overhang. We drove in silence for 20 minutes, the city lights blurring into long neon streaks of color. I knew we weren't headed to a station. We were heading toward the industrial docks, the very place where I had tracked the illegal shipments and the organized scheme. "You're taking me to the warehouse," I said, my voice hoarse. "Why? I'm already in custody. If this is about the charge, take me to the holding facility." The agent in the passenger seat turned around, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. "You aren't under arrest for a crime, Maya. You're being repatriated. Mr. Vane has been looking for a successor who can actually handle the heat of the international market. You passed the test by surviving as long as you did. The federal investigation, the charges, the public humiliation, it was all just a final evaluation." I felt a surge of cold fury. "You're delusional if you think I'll work for him. I'd rather burn this entire city to the ground." "You've already helped him do that," the agent replied, gesturing to the window. As we pulled into the dockyards, I saw the skyline of the city, a city I thought I was protecting, darken. A massive power failure hit the grid, leaving the skyscrapers looking like jagged, hollow teeth against the black sky. It was a blackout, orchestrated on a scale I hadn't realized was possible. The organized group you think you were fighting? You didn't fight them. You consolidated them. You cleared the path for Vane to take total control of the regional infrastructure. We pulled up to a massive, nondescript shipping container sitting in the center of a deserted pier. The doors were open, spilling a harsh, white light onto the damp concrete. Inside, I saw a desk, a chair, and a single screen playing a live feed of the city's collapsing logistics network. When they hauled me out of the car, I didn't struggle. I walked toward the container, my mind racing, looking for any opening, any flaw in their plan. My hands were still cuffed, but I felt a sharp, metallic bite against my thumb. It was the micro key I had sewn into the lining of my jacket months ago. A contingency plan I had hoped never to use. It was a bypass for the facility's electronic security, a master override for every digital system connected to the pier. As I stepped inside, the lights flickered and dimmed, and Julian Vane stepped out of the shadows. He looked older, more refined, but his eyes were the same, predatory, calculating, and hungry. "Maya," he said, his voice smooth as glass. "Welcome home. You've had a busy few months. I must say, your work in the shipping sector has been impeccable. It's a shame we have to end it here." "I'm not going to be your puppet, Julian," I spat, stepping toward the center of the room. "You think you've won because you have a few agents on your payroll? You've got no idea what I've set in motion." He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You've set nothing in motion that I didn't authorize. I've been watching your every move. You're a brilliant student, but you're still just a student. Now it's time to see if you can handle the real weight of this operation." He held up a small black remote, his finger hovering over the trigger. "This will initiate the final sequence. It will wipe your digital footprint entirely, effectively erasing you from existence. Or you can sign the transfer of all your holdings to me, and I'll ensure you spend the rest of your life in a gilded cage instead of a federal cell." I looked at the remote, then at the camera mounted on the container wall. I knew they were recording this. I shifted my thumb, feeling the micro key under my skin, preparing to force the override. If I could bridge the connection before he pressed that button, I could flip the kill switch back onto them. "You're forgetting one thing, Julian," I said, my voice steady, my heart pounding in rhythm with the flicker of the overhead lights. "I didn't just study your empire. I studied how to dismantle it from the inside out." I surged forward, not toward the door, but toward the main control terminal on the wall. I lunged, my handcuffed hands slamming into the console. The room groaned as the override kicked in, a high-pitched whine emanating from the walls. Julian's face twisted in panic as he realized what I was doing. He smashed the button on the remote, but it was too late. The lights went black, the sound of machinery grinding to a halt echoed across the pier, and the entire containment unit began to vibrate with the force of an impending, massive surge. "What have you done?" he screamed, his voice lost in the screech of tearing metal. The floor beneath us gave way, and as we plunged into the dark, cold water of the harbor, I realized the finality of the game we were playing. But as I sank into the freezing depths, I caught a glimpse of something on the surface, a flickering light, a sign that the signal I had triggered had finally reached its target, the emergency override of the federal authorities' server, exposing every single name, every single bribe, and every single crime committed by Vane's associates to the public in real time. I had destroyed him. But as the weight of the water pulled me deeper, I realized the cost. I wasn't just exposing them. I was dragging the entire system down with me. And somewhere in the dark, I heard the distinct sound of a submarine engine, and a hand grabbed my collar, pulling me toward a fate I couldn't yet see. The icy water clawed at my lungs, a numbing, crushing pressure that threatened to drag me into the abyss of the harbor. Just as the darkness began to swallow my consciousness, the iron grip on my collar yanked me upward. I broke the surface, gasping for air, my chest heaving as I was hauled onto the deck of a sleek, unmarked vessel. I coughed up brine, shaking uncontrollably, and looked up into the face of my rescuer. It wasn't one of Vane's men. It was the woman I had thought was my assistant, the one who had turned me in. But her eyes weren't cold anymore. They were alert, sharp, and entirely focused. "Keep your head down," she hissed, pulling me into the shadows of the gunnel. "The extraction team is already closing in on the pier. You did it, Maya. You triggered the leak. The entire infrastructure of Vane's network is being dismantled in the public eye right now. Look." She handed me a rugged, waterproof tablet. I stared, my vision blurring, as the screen scrolled through a cascade of leaked data. Every account, every shell company, every bribe paid to the Service of Internal Security, and every coordinate of their illegal storage facilities.
It was all there, visible to every major news outlet and law enforcement agency in the world. The organized scheme was effectively dead. "You worked for me," I whispered, the realization hitting me with as much force as the freezing water. "You were never a mole for them." She offered a grim smile. "I was a deep cover operative for the only agency that wasn't on Vane's payroll. We needed you to draw him out, to make him believe he'd won so he'd consolidate his assets into one place. You were the bait, Maya, and you were brilliant." I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me, more profound than anything I had ever known. I had been a pawn, but in the final act, I had become the player who decided the board.
My life as I knew it, the billions, the influence, the shadow games, was gone. The name Maya Vance was effectively radioactive. "What happens now?" I asked, looking back toward the pier. The industrial site was swarming with federal tactical units, the honest ones this time, moving with precision to secure the site and apprehend the remnants of Vane's syndicate. I saw Julian Vane being led away in heavy restraints, his face a mask of shattered pride and defeated rage. He didn't even look back. He knew he was facing an enormous sentence, the kind from which no amount of money could buy an escape. "Now, you vanish," the operative said, handing me a small, heavy pouch and a set of keys. "Your assets were liquidated by the board, but we were able to secure a contingency trust in a neutral jurisdiction. It's enough to start over, anywhere in the world, but you can never return to the life you had. The world thinks you were the mastermind of the entire organized scheme. If you surface, the public, the courts, and every remaining rival will come for you." I took the pouch, feeling the weight of the gold and the digital credentials inside. It was a new beginning, stripped of the greed and the ego that had defined my previous years. I watched as the harbor receded into the mist, the city skyline now illuminated by the sirens of justice finally being served. Months later, I sat on a terrace overlooking a quiet, sun-drenched coast in the Mediterranean. My name was no longer Maya Vance. I had traded the boardroom for a quiet life of consulting for humanitarian efforts, a way to use my understanding of systems to help those who had been exploited by people like Elias Sterling and Julian Vane. I checked my phone, a secure, encrypted device, and saw a news alert. Julian Vane had been sentenced. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, a forgotten relic of a bygone era of arrogance. The organized scheme he built had been fully dismantled, and the millions I had lost were being funneled into a massive recovery fund for the victims of the logistics corruption. I leaned back, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. I had lost the billionaire status, the skyscraper views, and the power to command a room with a look. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't calculating the next move in a game of death. I was free. The waitress brought my coffee, and I caught my reflection in the window of the cafe. I looked different. The hard, sharp edges of the woman who walked into the Sterling boardroom had softened. I was still brilliant, still capable, and still the woman who had brought down an empire. But the hunger for power had been replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, in the end, I was the only one who had survived the fire with my soul intact. As I finished my coffee, a courier placed a small envelope on my table and walked away without a word. I opened it, expecting a threat, but found only a single sheet of paper. It was a handwritten note, simple and to the point. "The game is over, Maya. Don't ever play it again." I smiled, tore the note into small pieces, and watched as the breeze scattered them into the sea. I reached for my book, took a long, slow sip of my coffee, and decided that the only game worth playing was the one where you finally, truly, belong to yourself. I didn't look back as I walked away from the table, toward a future that was finally, completely my own. The billionaire was gone, but the person who had risen from the ashes was far more powerful than money could ever hope to be. The story of the woman who mocked the world had ended, and the story of the woman who reclaimed her life had finally begun.